Today on Nozzlehead Notes podcast, we are back. We're going to be talking about some crop updates. We're also going to be talking about soybean cutoff stages for herbicide application and getting ready for fungicide season. All right, welcome back, everyone, to another edition of Nozzlehead Notes podcast. It's Brady and Jared here, and we're excited. We've kind of had some scheduling issues here the last few weeks, but we hope to get back to a kind of more regular schedule here and see how things go. So, first up, Jared, let's talk a little bit about crop updates. Where are you, and what are you seeing?
Well, currently, you can see my background looks a little different here today. I'm at the Midwest Research Farm in Seymour, Illinois. We've had some customer tours going on in this part of the world that I've been helping with, and I've actually been out looking at a lot of fields. We've got rapidly growing crops over here, and frankly, wouldn't hurt to have a little bit of rain through most of my geography, but nothing is in a detrimental state yet. Corn's clicking along pretty good. Most of it is, anywhere between waist and shoulder high. If, for the most of it, bulk of the planted acres, I guess, that got into reasonable time. So there's some laggards and whatnot. But the beans are a little bit all over the board. We've got wheat coming out, so double crop beans are definitely a consideration going in the ground. And then we've got stuff now that is actually starting to see some flowers on it because those earlier planted beans are really starting to mature up pretty quickly.
Gotcha. Well, kind of a little bit, some of the same and some different. I had a field day this morning and I actually had some folks up from Kansas, and you mentioned wheat. Hearing some disappointing results for wheat harvest. Awful dry down there, and I've not heard much local, but we didn't have, because of the dry weather early on, I don't know if we had high hopes for it or not, but wheat is coming out in some areas. And then also corn really taken off this week. We've seen some of the earlier planted fields and stuff like that take off and start to shoot for the moon type of thing here. But we've still got some stuff that's a little bit coming along with variable planting. We've had some replant in some of our storm areas, and beans are still all over the board. I see some beans fields that are really starting to fill in, and I see bean fields that are just getting started. So they are definitely all over the place, and it's going to be interesting to see how they catch up. We may have some awful short beans flowering pretty soon too as well. But all in all, I think, we've gotten some rains. We're kind of in that same spot. We certainly wouldn't turn down a rain. We had a couple weeks of bad storms, so we kind of would be all right with just some nice rain instead of the flying ice in the fields. That's kind of tough on things.
Yeah, it sure is. And we talked a little bit about beans getting all over the place and some short beans flowering. Now that we're past this June 21st, the longest day of the year, these beans, not only because of the GDDs we've accumulated, but also the nights starting to get longer again, it's going to trigger flowering. And one of the biggest questions I'm getting right now to transition into a topic I want to talk about today is, how late can we spray some of these herbicides? A lot of pre's are doing pretty good. We've got quite a bit of post applications already on in my geography. I know there's some dicamba applications trying to get finished up in Missouri here before the cutoff date. Illinois has obviously been shut off, but, starting to think about things like Liberty and Enlist and glyphosates. We start getting flowers on these plants. Everybody, starts asking questions about, how late should I push it? So what's your thoughts on this, Brady?
Well, I think the first thing that's obviously up here in a couple days is our June 30th date. And so we can't do after June 30th. So that's going to be our day for Ingenia applications and dicamba over the top of soybeans for Nebraska. And it is also for Missouri as well. Iowa and Illinois a little bit different, Minnesota too as well. But that's throughout the other parts of the Midwest, we're seeing that June 30th date. So that's obviously the preeminent thing. Now, I had a question earlier today. There's no longer, for states that don't have individual restrictions, there's no growth stage on the label. It is June 30th that applications go through. So if you have R1, you still can go to June 30th on those states that don't have other restrictions.
With Ingenia, that's correct.
With Ingenia, yes. I should say with Ingenia product. That's a great reminder there too.
Yes, some of those other brands will have either an R1 restriction or that growth stage restriction, depending on if it's got the residual in the tank with it and whatnot.
Right, exactly. So, and then I think that's the one that's the date one. Now the others all pretty much flip to growth stage restrictions, and so you're watching what those individual herbicides have and those type of things, and keeping an eye on that. Obviously, with flowering beginning in a lot of fields, that's going to affect our Liberty applications too, for where we're at with that. So, go ahead.
I was just going to say that with the flowering, and the reason why we stop a lot of that, and I think it's important to talk about, is when soybeans enter that reproductive phase, it starts to lose its ability to react, right, or to adjust for stresses. And so when we start to put herbicides on there, even though they're traded, the plant has to metabolize and take care of that herbicide and move it basically away from that site or break it apart through that metabolism, and that costs energy. And so anytime we're putting that on a plant in those reproductive phases, it has a potential to start throwing blooms off and potentially impact yield. Is it going to kill the plant? No, the tolerance is still there, but it starts to translate into yield. And, some products go a little bit later than others, but all I'll tell you is the later you get into the reproductive phases, the higher the risk. And so that's why we have these cutoffs where we do. And I think that's important to throw out here, because you may have one or two weeds left in that field and they're just driving you nuts and you feel like you can go out and clean it up. And sometimes you do a little more harm than good, especially as we start to get into these heavy reproductive stages. You may be better off just weed hooking them or walking if it's just a few, right?
Right. I think that's, the big point there is, let's go back to before we had traded crops and growth stages, and we were looking at, things like the burners, the ultra blazers, and the cobras, and those type of things like that. When did we find out that they really hurt yields? When we got into that reproductive stage type of thing. And that's when, you can really burn a field pretty harshly with a product like one of the PPOs. But if you do it when it's still in the vegetative stages, it's way different than if you're that late application trying to get big weeds and everything else like that. And you can really bang up on some yields. Traded crops give us a little bit more safety, but not out of the woods entirely. And so we have to, I think, be aware and cautious. And we just, it kind of gets to that stage where the only thing we want to be thinking about as we get in those reproductive stages, as we'll talk later, is about fungicide applications or insecticide applications. So, but start to steer away from the herbicides. And sometimes you can do more harm than good trying to control weeds out there that you think you're going to get. It may be better to deal with them later, deal with them next year, however, than to try to go out there and hurt the crop more.
And I've had people tell me that they've gone out and bordered fields. Usually at the end of the year, the edges are the worst. So they'll go out and run, their edges with their sprayer. And you can see it right to the line in the combine a lot of times with that. And a lot of that depends on weather, too. If we get, ample rain and cooler, not terribly hot conditions, that impact that you see may not be there. It may lessen. But, because we can't control the weather, you are putting any of that late application at risk. And that's why the labels say what they say. So I try to encourage guys to be proactive in nature. This is why we talk about these 2-pass programs in soybeans all the time, so we don't have to put ourselves in those spots.
Yeah, I think layering residuals is huge with this discussion too, because it gives us the ability or the flexibility to not have to come back later because we're still living on residual and then the canopy. But I think the thing to keep in mind, and people say, well, okay, R1 versus R2. R2 is really R1. We know we're going to lose a big chunk of those flowers from that type of thing, and it's going to put on new flowers and those type of things. R2 is a stage where we're really starting to get into pod development type of thing. Obviously, R3 is when we start to see pods, but that development stage is in that R2 stage type of thing like that, and heading into R3, R4 of those type of things. And so I think that protecting that, staying away from those later applications is huge. No matter what product you're using, I don't care, if it's glyphosate tolerant, dicamba tolerant, glufosinate tolerant, whatever. I just stay away from it when you get into those later R stages for sure. Absolutely. And the labels say such. So.
That's right. And one other thing to note here, since you're bringing up layering residuals, a couple of products are Outlook and Zidua. Those have a vegetative cutoff. So Outlook could be V5 and Zidua V6. And your beans may be far enough along, but I've got some younger beans out here. After we get past that stage, reason we cut those off is, we see a little bit more crop response as far as catching more down the leaves. And secondly, we're getting less of it to the ground. And that's where those residuals need to work anyway. So we're really just trying to get the crop canopy. You start to get past those stages, we just can't get enough of it to the ground, in my opinion, to be as effective. So that's why when we make these plans and these layered residuals, there are cutoffs on those as well. Maybe those are a little less risky when those are pushed, but that the labels say it for a reason, right? We do see crop response, and we did get less of it to the ground. So that's why, again, stress following those labels and making that plan to get them in that time frame, because it's still a pretty big window from emergence through V5 or 6, depending on which product you're using.
Well, maybe one episode, maybe sometime when we have some spare time, we should talk about the whole thing of kind of the canopy architecture and getting product to the ground or to its target. Because I know we're probably both out looking at some big weed misses and different things like that and seeing that. And that's one of the biggest things. You can go out and spray big weeds, but you can miss the stuff underneath. Same thing with, like you talk about, with the crop gets big enough, you're not getting that residual herbicide down to the ground. And so getting your herbicide to the target could almost be probably 2 or 3 podcasts, quite honestly, if we really dove into it. For those that would be interested in that one. But okay, so we've kind of covered the herbicides. We got a crop update. How about, what do you think about getting ready for plant health?
Yeah, I think we're coming right up on it. I mean, I pulled into a field there right before I came over here for these field days just to check some corn. We're anywhere between, some tassels poking, all the way to, most of my corn, I would say, is between 2 and 3 leaves away from seeing that tassel. So we're getting close, I guess. Some areas are way closer than others. You get far south, they're probably right on it, but or very, very close. But up here in the northern half of the geography, we're probably looking here in a couple of weeks, we're going to be pretty busy for corn. Soybeans obviously take a little bit longer, but I think we're going to start shifting our gears here on these calls a little bit toward that focus, and hopefully touch base a little more often, because every year's a little different. There's a lot of reasons to spray a fungicide, and I think it's important that we touch base on that.
Yeah, I think those things that we talk about and we cover for plant health are definitely important. Like I say, they're going to vary a little bit as we go through, but right now we're at a stage, you may have some corn that doesn't look very big, but by this time next week, you're going to be like, wow, because we've got the temperatures and we've got some humidity coming. And so I think we'll see some pretty rapid corn growth type of thing. The old adage of where you can almost hear it growing from that. And the watch out, we'll talk about this too. I think this would be an interesting topic to get into a little bit is that, like you said, beans are still a few weeks off. Don't get excited because you think, oh, R1's here and just every week we're going to click a growth stage through with beans. That's not, they don't click along like corn does. They work differently. So, and we'll talk about that as we get into that. So that just about wraps up our time we have today, but we definitely appreciate you listening, and stay tuned. Like I said, we're going to switch our focus over here to more plant health based stuff in the weeks to come. For those of you watching, be sure that you like and subscribe and on YouTube, and then like and watch us on SoundCloud, or listen to us on SoundCloud as well. And let us know if there's any topics you'd like to see. All right, we'll talk to you next time.